When you're ready, get started. Okay. Good morning and good afternoon from Washington, Ankara, and those that are joining. My understanding is that we have people joining from several from different places in North America, but also Europe, Turkey as well. And so, I just wanted to welcome everybody here to the German Marshall Fund, the United States, and our Front Lines of Democracy initiative to this webinar. I call it a pop-up webinar because we'll be doing more of these given the circumstance, the challenges right now. And this is a timely conversation. I also want to thank our On Turkey series led by our Ankara office, GMF's Ankara office, for also joining with us today. Speaking from Ankara, we're going to be hearing from panelists who are going to be talking about the background implications and an update on the Turkish government's recent incursion into Syria and the implementation of the Turkey-Russia agreement on northeast Syria. They're also going to focus on domestic, political, and economic implications of the military operation with Turkey. And I think more important too, there's an awful lot of interest not only in what is happening in terms of U.S.-Turkish relations. In fact, this past week, U.S. Congress passed, and the House passed a legislation regarding additional sanctions on Turkey. It hasn't happened in the Senate yet, the U.S. Senate. We'll see what happens. But I think a lot of people are very interested to know and better understand the implications of this operation, of Operation Peace Spring, which started basically, it's about almost a month. At the end of this week will be about a month long, but also the implications internally, what's happening domestically in Turkey, the impact on the public. I have a series of questions to ask really related to that because I think while there's a lot of discussion here in Washington and I think maybe in Europe about the current operations in Syria and things are changing on the ground almost daily, there's really not a lot of discussion about what's taking place in Turkey itself as well. And I think there's a lot of interest whether Turkey is actually safer today than it was 3 weeks ago. Is the internal instability or growing internal instability really something to be concerned about? Issues including Kurdish issues that remain. But I think we have both an audience here in DC, but also I know there's a number of people who are online. We're going to ask them to weigh in with questions at a specific point. But I really wanted to, Ozgur, to hand it over to you, to my colleague who runs GMF's office in Ankara, to introduce the speakers, but also to weigh in on, I know, something that is obviously on the front of the news for everybody in Turkey, and also because we play a role, GMF does, in strengthening U.S.-Turkish relations. I think it's really important, given all of the chaff and all of the focus on this issue, that we're still focused on trying to find ways to ensure that this relationship remains as strong as it can be given the circumstance. And so I wanted to hand it over to Ozgur because he and I both have spent a lot of time, even over the last several weeks, trying to figure out how best to keep this relationship in a good space, but also not only the relationship with the United States and Turkey, but this transatlantic community as well. And so there's a lot to discuss. Ozgur, I'm going to send it over to you and to colleagues there to speak to these issues. And really, thank you so much. I know it's the end of your day to participate, and I know everybody's really busy, so thank you. And Ozgur, I wanted to send it over to you in Ankara. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear us well?
Yes.
Okay, that's good to hear. Good morning and good evening, everyone, depending on where you are right now. I'm Ozgur Unluhisarcikli, as Jonathan said, the Ankara Office Director at the German Marshall Fund. On my left, I have Professor Şaban Kardeş, Professor of IR at TOBB University in Ankara. On my right, I have Haldun Yalçınkaya, who is also Professor of IR at the TOBB University, but also Head of the IR Department, and a retired colonel from the Turkish Army and a former NATO officer. What we'll be doing today is I will provide a brief background and then leave it over to Şaban and Haldun. And for your information, for your questions, Şaban is a very good, big thinker, let's say. So he could give us also, let's say, broader implications of what's going on. And Haldun, although of course now he's a professor of IR, of course he's a retired officer, so he could also provide us some operational aspects of the operation, as well as of course his current area of research is radicalization and Daesh networks in Turkey. So with this, let me start my brief background. First, I would like to point at one of the aspects of US-Turkey relations nowadays, which is mutual suspicions. And with these mutual suspicions, I mean the following four suspicions: two on the American side, two on the Turkish side, which are actually very related to what's going on. I observe that there is a growing suspicion in Washington that Turkey at some point could flip to the dark side. And there the dark side, of course, being mainly Russia. And therefore, Turkish policies such as buying S-400 systems from Russia are seen through the prism of flipping to the dark side. There is another suspicion in Washington, which is growing, is that Turkey has a hidden foreign policy agenda in the Middle East, which is cooperating with radical Islamists to undermine certain allies of the United States in the Middle East. This is also growing, and for example, Turkey's cooperation with certain groups in Syria is also seen through these prisms. Now, there are also suspicions in Turkey. There is a sticky suspicion among the Turkish society, very widespread, that the United States has a long-term plan of creating a Kurdish state on Turkey's borders, which would in time destabilize Turkey. Here, I would like to provide you with a number. In Turkey, we have something called the Sevr syndrome. Sevr syndrome being a reference to the Sevr Treaty, which the Ottoman Empire was forced to sign after the First World War, which disintegrated today's Turkey into many smaller parts, most of them under the control of foreign states: the British zone of control, the French mandate, the Italian zone of control, broader Armenia, broader Kurdistan, etc., etc. Now, this map is very vivid on the eyes of every Turkish citizen. And there is a very good survey question that has been asked for decades. The question being, please tell me if you agree or disagree with the following statement. And the question is, Western powers want to disintegrate Turkey the way they tried in the aftermath of the First World War. Now, in the past, 75% of the respondents in Turkey would say, I agree. During the last 5 years, this number has increased to 85%. So 85% of Turkish citizens believe that Western powers have a plan to disintegrate Turkey. This is a conspiracy theory, but for anyone who believes in this, this is a perception which is a placeholder for reality. This is the reality through which we see, for example, US policies in the Middle East. There is another suspicion, which is more important, let's say, for President Erdogan and the immediate circles around him, which is that the United States has a plan to remove President Erdogan from power. He has said, actually, on the record, in a public speech, and in the following sentence, please replace they with the United States of America. They have come against us with the Gezi protests. They have failed. They have come against us with corruption allegations. They have failed. They have come against us with a coup attempt. They have failed. Now they are coming at us economically. They are failing. In the future, they will again come against us using other means, and they will fail again. So here you see how serious President Erdogan in suspecting that the United States has a plan in removing him. So these are actually suspicions and emotions that have moved Turkey towards the Operation Peace Spring. What do Turks, or what does Turkey think it has done with the Operation Peace Spring? Turkey's policy was actually crystal clear from the beginning. Turkey regards YPG, when I say as an extension of the PKK, it's actually not inaccurate. Turkey sees YPG and the PKK to be in the same organizational chart. And if you want to see what the organizational chart is, please Google KCK organizational chart. So you can see lots of pictures on the web on how YPG and PKK are related. It's, of course, they are like all Marxist organizations, they are using all letters in the alphabet to set up their organization, so it is difficult for me to explain. But so far as Turkey is concerned, YPG is the Syrian branch of the PKK. The PKK is a designated terrorist organization, including by the United States of America, has killed tens of thousands of Turkish citizens, and it has a public intention to kill more and to harm Turkish security. So Turkey's policy is that our ally, the United States, should not have cooperated with the YPG, and that we need to fight the PKK in all of its forms, wherever they are in proximity to Turkey's borders. The question could be, why did Turkey tolerate for so many years, if that was the position? There were two reasons. First of all, the American explanation was with 3 T's, that this is a tactical, transactional, and temporary relationship with the YPG. It would be over as soon as Daesh is eliminated, but it did not happen. So Turkey saw the relationship evolving from the 3 T's to 1S, which is strategic. So Turkey decided to move. Second, of course, in the past, Turkey did not have the means. At this point, Turkey decided that now this was within Turkey's reach, and there was a US president who was accommodating to such policy. Now, Turkey's Peace Springs operation is not beyond criticism at all. There could be a long list of criticisms towards this operation, which I also agree with, starting actually from Turkey's Syria policy in the beginning. I mean, both of our countries, or actually many of our countries, there are also Europeans in the room, have actually contributed to the destabilization of Syria, and then left the destabilization of Syria premature and left it in the open. And here we are. So Turkey's mistakes have actually started from there. But more recently, actually, Turkey, when preparing for this operation, did not make any, let's say, explanation, or did not persuade anyone that it would be sensitive to ethnic realities on the ground. On the contrary, when everyone was criticizing that Turkey would try to change the ethnic reality on the ground, Turkey did not respond at all. So Turkey could have been more sensitive on this. Of course, second, some of course, our colleagues may disagree with me, but I believe that Turkey's ongoing relationship with Syrian non-state actors is a mistake. Turkey should divorce itself from Syrian non-state actors, because if it does not, it will own the problems that create. The same thing actually goes for the United States as well. The United States is in retrenchment mode, and it has the tendency to offload responsibilities to other actors. But if the United States continues to offload responsibilities to non-state actors, then the United States will own the problems that these non-state actors create. So I would make this criticism to both countries, but the criticisms that I do not agree with are the following. Any criticism that is all based on the, let's say, mentality of using Kurds and the YPG interchangeably is wrong. Like when the United States has a war against, let's say, Daesh, ISIL, it's not a war against Islam, it's not a war against Muslims, or it's not a war against Arabs, right? So Turkey's war against the PKK is not a war against Kurds. The second criticism that I would not agree with is that Turkey's operation was a massacre, was a genocide, etc., etc. Actually, if you look at the operation, the rate of civilian casualties is remarkably low compared to some other theaters in Syria, such as Raqqa and Mosul. And unfortunately, most of the criticisms towards Turkey is based on these two arguments, that Turkey is attacking Kurds and that this is a massacre. Turkey is not attacking Kurds, Turkey is fighting a terrorist organization, and the rate of civilian casualties, although we could say even one civilian is too many, still it's comparably low compared to other theaters. And one thing that actually breaks my heart is saying that Turks are massacring our Kurdish allies. Because honestly, I thought that Turkey was an ally of the United States, but in these sentences, I always see the word ally associated to some other actor than Turkey. And this actually is quite heartbreaking for millions of Turks who are strongly pro-American still. Let me stop here, turn over to Shaban to explain to us what all of this means politically and geopolitically.
Thank you, Ozgur. Hello to everyone in the room as well as online. Ozgur provided a very broad outline. So let me also come back to some of the issues he also raised, but briefly, first to outline my own perspective on the new Syrian dynamics in the wake of the Turkish military operation. Firstly, we should keep in mind that the operation triggered two separate and, in a sense, complementary deals. One with the United States and the other with Russia. There are questions about the new phase of the Syrian conflict after these deals. So the first question we need to ask is whether we may now move to post-conflict phase. Now that there are two deals that seek to bring the conflict potential under control. And also parallel to it, there's an ongoing political process in Geneva where the Constitutional Committee is meeting. So the question is, are we done with conflict in Syria? Can we talk about moving forward to the post-conflict phase? Personally, I would say that in the wake of the Turkish military operation and the two deals, unfortunately, we are not there yet. So the potential for seeing further conflict is still there. We cannot safely assume that from now on we will be talking about the political aspects of the Syrian crisis. Why I believe so? Partly because of the so-called maturation theory about civil war termination. So as you would recall, the theory would argue that when the parties to a civil war feel that they have exhausted all their means and options, this is when they move to post-conflict phase. Personally, I think that we are not there yet, especially the Turkish military operation. As Ozgur mentioned, it reversed certain gains of the PKK-PYD, but it also opened up new questions. So in the coming phase, not only between Turkey and PKK-PYD, but between the regime and the PKK-PYD, between the regime and Turkey, different scenarios for new local or wider conflicts cannot be excluded altogether. And I think the parties on the ground, they still feel that they can achieve something by still fighting. So in that respect, I'm not hopeful about the political process in the days to come. The second question we need to ask at this juncture, I believe, is sort of a very simple question. Who caused the shocks in Syria? Given the Turkish military incursion and the two deals in the aftermath of the Turkish operations, I think overall, as Ozgur also mentioned earlier, there are questions not only about the US credibility in the region, also in the eyes of Turkish decision makers, but also the US ability to shape the developments on the ground. So in that respect, I think the US is moving in a direction where it can, or it may be exercising less and less leverage in terms of shaping the dynamics on the ground in Syria. So Russia, with this recent deal that it brokered with Turkey, and also given the ability it exercised in terms of getting the Syrian regime on board, getting indirectly perhaps Iranians on board, and the PYD on board. So I think we can safely assume that in terms of shaping the developments on the ground, Russia may be the most influential actor. So we have also seen that Iran overall may not be exercising influence on the ground compared to what it used to back in 2015, 2016. So there is a declining Iranian leverage in the broader Syrian crisis. Following these two points, let me also come back to the issue about Turkey, what the operation implies for Turkey, for Turkey's Syria policy in particular. Here I will try to avoid overlaps with Ozgur as much as possible. I think
which is not too much.
Partly yes. So I mean, the recent operation, as Ozgur also partly mentioned, reflects and underscores the new security culture that was breeding in Turkey, especially post 2014, 2015, where defensive considerations, the concerns for threats to Turkey's vital interests, and plus the very survival of the territorial integrity of the nation state of Turkey came to dominate the thinking of the strategic circles in Ankara. So one should put the current military operation in that context, and in that regards, the successive military operations since 2016, different incursions into Syria, but at the same time, growing Turkish military action in Iraq against the PKK formations there, as well as Turkey's changing policy vis-à-vis the KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government, especially in the context of the 2017 referendum. So I think they form a pattern where defensive security considerations are shaping Turkey's regional policies. But another striking element in this new strategic culture is the eagerness, willingness to use force beyond borders. So perhaps later my colleague Haldun will also touch on some of those issues. The willingness to use force beyond borders, as it happens anywhere, raises a lot of questions, from maybe legal questions to military tactical questions, as well as strategic questions. So I think since 2015-16, Turkey has passed a certain threshold where it is more willing to exercise the military option when it comes to addressing the security threats beyond the border. So in that respect, there is a greater willingness to resort to hard power instruments. So this is where we can see that there is a growing narrative in Ankara where there is a direct equation between boots on the ground and having influence on the diplomacy table. So this narrative is also shaping the security circles in Turkey, in the sense that if you want to get something out in the diplomacy table, if you want to prevent the maps in the region from being withdrawn, you have to be actively there on the ground. You have to put your military might, muscle on the battle theater. So this operation, I think, has solidified this trend even further. And this is where I don't want to take too much of time, especially to give further space for Haldun, but let me also disagree with Ozgur's latest point about the proxies, Turkey employing proxies. So I'm not going to do a kind of normative judgment about whether that policy is right or wrong. I will take more of a kind of realist position here. So I would say it works. So especially given that the employment of proxies is going in a sort of hand-in-hand manner with the employment of military hard power instruments in the region, I think in the years to come, rather than seeing Ozgur's call for divorcing with the proxies, we may expect more engagement with the proxies, because at the end of the day, Turkey is more willing and ready to use military instruments, but as a democratic society, the leaders being under domestic constraints, I think they will also feel that using proxies will be a more economic, more rewarding and less politically costly tool to address the security challenges in the years to come. So I would say that you shouldn't see a sudden divorce. I don't know what Haldun will say about it, but I can make this prediction: as long as this emphasis on hard power stays, Turkey's engagement with different groups on the ground in Syria will continue. And then this is also quite a drastic change from the established old Republican foreign policy credentials of Turkey. So this is also one of the new trends in the Turkish foreign policy making, and it is potentially likely to create discussions domestically as well in the years to come. Here I'll stop.
Thank you, Shaban. Before turning to Haldun, Shaban, I look at where Turkey's position before the Syrian uprising and where we are today. I believe that if in the beginning we had not supported the non-state actors and continued to directly, from day one, continued to directly communicate with the Syrian regime and other relevant state actors, we would have been in a better position. But of course we can't now.
But the counterfactuals, of course, what if, so there's no end. But we should, I think, here acknowledge that in the region, the employment of proxies has become quite an important and integral element of regional geopolitics. And this is where, especially in the Turkish discussions, in the initial phase of the Syrian crisis, for instance, the reason why Iran was so much advancing, Iran was in a better position in the earlier phases of the Syrian crisis. One explanation given was that Iran has been quite experienced in terms of using such proxy elements. So this was something that was missing in the Turkish discussion. So this is something that in the Turkish thinking we are learning, and I think this is my argument. The more we learn how to use them, the more we would like to keep them. So that's why I don't expect a sudden divorce, to repeat your phrase again.
Thank you, Shaban. So, Haldun, please fill in the gaps wherever we left them. Second, please do address this issue of using proxies. And of course, I mean, on Daesh, first of all, how does Turkey's operation change the realities on the ground regarding Daesh? Does Turkey expose itself to a bigger Daesh threat with this? And also, do let us know a little bit about the Daesh network in Turkey.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody on the table and on the screens. I think I'm lucky because Ozgur and Shaban have already framed our conference, so to say. So I'm going to speak three different subjects. First, Operation Peace Spring. The second, on Daesh problem, and the third, the highly demanded issue by the first two speakers, proxies, the position of proxies from Turkey. I don't know why this issue raised so much for me to fulfill, but we will see. As for the Operation Peace Research, as you mentioned, Jonathan, at the end of this week, it will be at the first month. So the issue for Operation Peace Spring, launching the death operation 24 days ago, 25 days ago, was going back to different columns. The first column would be short-term record, historical record of the region, and the long-term historical one. The long-term one was Turkey's lessons learned from northern Iraq, and after the Gulf War in the 1990s and the Iraq War, northern Iraq became safe haven for PKK, which caused a security problem for Turkey for more than 3 decades. As for the short-term record of Turkey, historical record of Turkey for launching Operation Peace Spring, would be our experience with Americans, Turks and Americans, how to operate, how to patrol problem in Munich for 2 years. As a humble retired Turkish officer, I mean, in the beginning of 2000s, I was in Afghanistan, and I was commanding, or I was under command of my American colleagues in Afghanistan without any coordination, because we had all necessary measures and regulations are in harmony with Americans and Turks, and we all know, and Turkish military and the Turkish politicians are all are aware, Manbij patrolling issue was beating the bush around. So it was a case for Turkey for Operation Peace Spring. And let's go back for Operation Peace Spring. Let's go back beginning of the civil war, Syrian civil war. At the beginning of Syrian civil war, Turkey was sharing its border with Syria. Later, they substitute from Syrians to Daesh, and later from Daesh, Turkey began sharing its border with PKK-associated YPG. So this was a big problem for Turkey. Myself, in 2015, I saw Daesh flag in front of, across the Turkish Turkish flag in this very same border. So it is the area of operation for Operation Peace Spring. So it is quite understandable for Turkey changes of its interlocutors in Syrian border. So to some extent, stopping the operation would definitely save lives of Turkish soldiers. I do accept that issue because of the letter or diplomatic efforts, whichever you take. At the end of the day, as a NATO member, Turkish society is really surprised by the letter and the discussions against Turkey for discussing Turkey's NATO membership. It is also, let's say, a kind of problematic issue in Turkish society because of the fact that there is nothing to do with Syria and NATO membership. You know, Americans has a border with Mexico and border issues, and no one discusses membership of United States at NATO, understandably. And or France has military operations in Mali, in Africa, and no one has been discussing membership of France for NATO. But if you talk about Turkey, and from Turkish point of view, if we want to secure our border from Daesh, from PKK, or from the, let's say, bloody Syrian army from Turkish understanding, so when we take into account our border, the people among DC or some other places in Europe have been discussing membership of Turkey, although Turkey has been fulfilling its commitments in NATO, even during the Operation Peace Spring. I wrote an op-ed a couple of hours ago, yesterday, I shared with my colleague Shava, and it is really interesting. Just on the day of Operation Peace Spring, Turkish and Italian paratroopers were exercising in Europe with American colleagues. So Turkey has been fulfilling. So it shouldn't be a Damocles sword against Turkey NATO membership. So as for the second issue, Daesh problem from Turkish understanding, actually it seems like for Turkey's northern Syria, the problem of PKK is about the substitute where we take from the leaders' diplomacy, from our leader, president, your president. That's my take. It is about to change PKK problem to Daesh problem. Turkey has been taking Daesh problem and the remnants of Daesh to deal with them, and it is the cost of getting rid of eliminating PKK in the region. It's a kind of deal, something like that. From my understanding, I mean, known evil is better than unknown evil. So Daesh, there are lots of unknowns from Daesh side for Turkey. So it's a big deal for Turkey to deal with the Daesh problem. Although we have lots of problems with our European allies. So because we have been discussing in Turkey, before coming here on TV, I discussed about the fate of returning foreign terrorist fighters from Syria to Europe, they are stuck in Turkey because their citizenship were abolished by our European allies. So there are lots of problems for Turkey because the main problem for Turkey, de-radicalization of Turkish foreign terrorist fighters, Turkish citizen foreign terrorist fighters, not the European originated foreign terrorist fighters. But it seems to me, in addition to their families and wives, children, in addition to them, foreign terrorist fighters issue will be a big problem, burden for Turkey in future, which would destabilize Turkey in terms of terrorism waves spreading from Turkey to the rest of the world. So in the first circle, it's a problem of Turkey, but later that will be a problem of Europe as well as other parts of the world. As for the third issue, which my time is almost over, proxies issue. Yeah, I have been studying on war issues, and ever since I began studying on my postgraduate studies after graduation of military academy, I faced Martin van Creveld and transformation of war. Although there are lots of theoretical improvements after Martin van Creveld, but Martin van Creveld claimed exactly the same thing, that instead of militaries and armies, the groups would substitute ordinary military units. From my understanding, this is a kind of tendency coming from the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda and even Caucasia in the 1990s. It is ongoing for the time being. I am optimistic for the regular military armies or navies or air forces, whatever, but for regular military organizations, they should and they will play a very important role. So it is not only a problem for Turkey, but also a problem for every parties, especially in Syria, because I wouldn't call them proxy, I would prefer call them groups, non-state groups in the region. But I think anything can be happen suddenly in the region. Suddenly would Turkey discharge them, just like the other allies would need to suddenly discharge their proxies or their allied groups, non-state groups. Let me finish here. I think I provoked enough to raise questions. Let me finish here. Thank you very much.
So, Jonathan, back to you.
Great. Thank you for that. Excuse me. That breakdown, and also I think the Daesh question is really important for the United States. I did want to respond to say that. You know, more often than not, over the past, I've worked on Turkey for the last 2 decades in Washington. There's always a conversation about who lost Turkey. And I think my question in Turkey is you should be asking who lost the United States. Because I think today, the very question of how the U.S. views Turkey through a prism of President Erdogan has really colored the ability for those in the U.S. to see legitimate security concerns for Turkey. And I think if that's, and that's for something for Turkish policymakers to be thinking about as well. And this is just not, it's not an isolated situation. And I understand the frustration level with people seeing the reaction of the US Congress. But as somebody who saw the level of support for Turkey sort of go in a very negative direction over the last decade, I think it's really an important question. And how do we get that relationship back up? And I think right now, people view the problem as President Erdogan. They don't hold, for the most part, they don't hold the Turkish people responsible for what is taking place. But they do see somebody who the perception is has authoritarian tendencies, has taken Turkey in a different direction. It's not lost that the S-400 issue has been sort of hot in the agenda. And then there's a litany of issues below. So Ozgur, you mentioned several things too that sort of coloring this idea of mutual suspicions. And certainly one of them is the relationship with President Erdogan that has broken, this will help to break this relationship down. So I don't want to lose that. The other one is President Trump in Washington. This has also created a challenge as well for partners, including Turkey and others, that when a deal is struck in the manner that it was done, and then sort of via a tweet after the conversation, you can imagine how the foreign policy, defense establishment, Congress, and others start to feel about sort of how decisions are being made. And that unpredictability, the inability to understand what's coming next, or deal making that is done at the level of people who the perception is may have their own political interest at mind versus, and I'm not sort of casting judgment, clearly this is an issue and has been an ongoing issue for Turkey over many decades now in dealing with the challenge of terrorism. But when you can imagine the perspective of seeing these two leaders come together and make a deal, and then the President of the United States the day later saying, no, we're going to destroy Turkey's economy, don't do it, but I gave you the green light to do it. So I just want to say there's a lot of confusion, I think a lot of work to be done, and I appreciate you getting into the details of the conversation. And I will just say, having Turkey and Russia deal making at a time when Russia is under such scrutiny here as well, this relationship between Erdogan and Putin, which I wanted to ask about as well, and about how comfortable does the Turkish foreign policy and national security, and especially those that came out of NATO and that have worked in this, how comfortable do Turks really feel about that relationship with Moscow and with Putin? And is it, for my estimation, something to be concerned about domestically, but also in terms of what will come about in Syria, but also longer term ramifications as well. But one of the things I did want to do, and that will be my question to you, will be about Russia and about sort of the deal that was struck and the level of trust, real level of trust that exists. Because I think there's a perception in Washington and maybe elsewhere that somehow Moscow has replaced the United States as that partner, that there's an incredible amount of trust between Mr. Putin, Mr. Erdogan, and that because of this, Turkey is the Turkish balancing act is between the West and Russia has actually tilted much further towards Moscow, and that's a perception here that has been disconcerting for many. But I wanted to do this. I want to make sure that those who are watching online, we are going to be taking questions. So do we have any special instructions just to
use either the chat or the Q&A tab?
Okay.
We'll see both of those and monitor both of those
for
questions.
So we'll be taking questions coming in. We may have some others here that who are in Washington who want to start off. But my question, if I could pose to all of our speakers in Ankara, the Russia-Moscow Putin equation and how people perceive that, and how should we be perceiving that relationship here in Washington, also Ottawa, Brussels, elsewhere, those who are following this discussion today.
Jonathan, on the Russia question, as you know, Shaban actually also, together with Nicholas Danforth, our non-resident fellow, has written two separate pieces on why Turkey is pivoting away from the United States, from Russia, towards Russia. So I think Shaban is best placed to answer that question.
Thank you, Ozgur. Without repeating the entire paper, just briefly, those interested, of course, they are always welcome to go check the relevant pieces as you mentioned. But in response to Jonathan's question, and we also get similar questions here very often from the diplomatic community in Ankara as well, and the way I personally see it. So this question you pose two angles. Firstly, how Turkey feels about cutting deals with Russia at a time Russia is under sanctions by the United States, and the second angle is about the trust element involved in the entire relationship. Regarding the first one, I think the way actually the triangle Turkey, US, Russia relationship evolved in the last 1 year or so. Usually in the Western circles, it was framed more of a kind of either or terms. So Turkey was expected by our Western partners to make a choice. Be it as 400 thing, be it is Syria policy, either with us or with the Russians. So the Western thinking always pushes Turkey to make such a choice. When Turkey does try to work with Russia on certain files, it is always seen as kind of antithesis to Turkish-American relationship. based on our interactions here and based on our observation of the overall Turkish policy-making circles, this is not the way it is seen from Ankara. So never the choice is either or from the Ankara point of view, especially when it comes to choosing to work with Russia. It is usually framed by our decision makers a choice out of necessity. I remember back in 2016, before the launch of Turkey's first military operation in Syria against Daesh elements. Prior to it, several times President Erdogan did underline that he raised the same set of concerns with President Obama back then. He was not responsive, but when he did raise the same concerns with President Putin, he did appreciate or acknowledge Turkey's concerns, and this is a constant theme I have been following in his speeches, in his pre-prepared statements, even his occasional casual conversations. So for him, it is very obvious that when he does decide to work with Russia on certain files, he feels he has to do it because there is an urgent necessity, need, a threat out there that has to be responded, but the Western option is not there. I think we have seen a kind of summary of this dynamic right before the Turkish military operation. You would remember Vice President was visiting, and the day before his meeting with President Erdogan, there was an American delegation meeting with their Turkish counterparts, led by Dr. Ibrahim Kalın. And the day later, next day, during the meeting between the president and vice president, there was a Russian delegation meeting, again, the same Turkish delegation. So I think the way it unfolded, the American offer on the table was not enough to satisfy Turkey's whatever needs there. I'm not going into the specifics. Next day, whatever it was offered by Russia satisfied Turkish expectations. If the first day American offer was comprehensive enough to satisfy Turkey's, as was also phrased in the joint declaration, legitimate security concerns, there wouldn't be a need for the meeting with the Russian delegation next day. So I think this summarizes, in a sense, illustrates the dynamics of the Turkish-US and Russia relationship in the last couple of years. So Turkey feels it has certain urgencies that it has to respond to. American offer is there, but it is never enough. It is always short to meet the requirements, and then Russians are there to step in. So the second angle here, which you emphasized, I would broadly agree with your characterization of the trust. It is there. I mean, many people, insiders to circles in Ankara and Moscow, repeatedly emphasized that the leaders over the years built trust. So it is mutual. It is not just President Erdogan building trust with President Putin, but also President Putin vis-a-vis President Erdogan. They have developed this trust in the element, especially making credible commitments. You may not like the contents of the deals which were cut between Turkey and Russia. For instance, vis-a-vis Idlib, even the current deal may not 100% satisfy Turkey's expectations. When we look at different deals that were cut over the years, and especially about the implementation of the deal, we knew that not the entire YPG military elements were withdrawn from the agreed zone, but despite that, Russia said they have completed and Turkey took their word. So the overall dynamic shows that the trust element is there. It has been solidifying the partnership over the years. But we should also keep in mind that when we talk about the Russia-Turkey relationship, it has over the years become a multi-dimensional partnership. So here we are mostly looking at just the military strategic aspects of the Turkey-Russia relationship. But when we look at its transformation in the post-Cold War era in the 1990s, especially after 2000s, it has evolved as a multi-dimensional relationship with multiple files. So the more they cut deals in other respects, in economic, energy files, in quite many other aspects, I think the trust has been bred over these multiple issues. It's not just one single file, which is Syria.
And by the way, Shaban has written another on Turkey piece for us on Russia-Turkey relationship. And Shaban, there actually you had explained very well how the relationship is evolving from transactional to strategic. And Jonathan, part of your question was, are Turks comfortable with this? Actually, I think I'm not alone in being very uncomfortable, not least for the domestic implications. This says for Turkey, because actually Turkey's democratization had gained speed after Turkey joined NATO, but also because of the way Russia chooses, and you know this best because you work on the Balkans and the Caucasus as well as Turkey, because of the way Russia chooses to treat its allies and partners and so-called friends in the future. I think this is a honeymoon between Russia and Turkey, and I think we're just watching the advertisements. I hope we'll never have to watch the real movie.
Well, I just want to thank you for that, and I am looking forward to reading your latest piece on Russia and Turkey. And as an observer of this region and observing Russia's relations with countries that border Turkey, but also in the Black Sea region, that these relationships tend to be very personalized between leaders versus addressing the needs and concerns of the Turkish public. And I think over time, the biggest challenge is Russia's interference in things like elections, areas, soft spots like the refugee issue. And then also the idea and concept, I suppose, for Turkey to have Russian boots on the ground, joint patrolling on its border, and something that we probably wouldn't have seen. So, in the past. And I just wonder too, if, that this has very much become like Trump, Erdogan, a relationship between sort of leaders versus between peoples and between sort of interests, real interests of public. So that's something we can discuss at a further date, because we'll have hopefully more opportunities to do this. I did want to open it up to questions here, if anybody had any questions. Please go ahead and just let us know where you're from.
Sure. Jameson Cunningham with American Free Syria. Two quick questions, one backward-looking, one forward-looking. I think you touched on this a little. What happens with the joint patrols that were happening between the United States and United States and Turkey in the north and northeast of Syria? It seemed like they were happening. What kind of led to the impatience? And then the second question is related to that and Idlib province in the northwest. Do you expect a deal to happen between Turkey and Russia in perhaps giving Idlib province back to the regime in Russian control, Turkey pulling out, or what could that look like there?
Yeah, and were you guys able to hear those questions? Okay. Yes. And also we had Michael in Sweden also had a very similar question about Idlib as well. So I know there's a real interest in what comes next.
So the first question, Haldun, I think it's your question. So the question is, United States and Turkey already had an agreement and they were conducting joint patrols in the east of the Euphrates, and suddenly Turkey decided to move unilaterally. What happened with those patrols that Turkey grew impatient?
Actually, I don't know. The simple answer is I don't know. I would just predict what would happen. I think loss of trust between two parties on the one hand. On the other hand, I think we have been living through a rally between United States and Turkey coming from June 2019, from the Osaka meeting onwards. So before the Osaka meeting, we were just so concerning about S-400 sanctions against Turkey, but in July, it was postponed until April 2020 for Turkey to launch or to run the S-400 missile system, and later I think everything has been changing from among the leaders, as you mentioned. So I wouldn't assume that something would happen between Turkish troops and the United States troops in the region. It was something beyond the regional issues, but it is not a big, let's say, I really wonder the difference between Turkish military's cooperation with Eurocom and Turkish military's cooperation with CENTCOM. So if you take into account other side of the border, Turkey's interlocutor is CENTCOM. If you talk about the inner border of Turkey, you might consider Turkey's military relation with Eurocom. So this differentiation really matters on the field, but other than that, I assume it is highly connected to capitals and their leaders. That would be the answer the answer I don't know.
Yeah. Let me also add 2 points to this question. So far as I understand, I'm not privy to the facts on the ground, but the Turkish military felt that it was being taken for a ride with these patrols, that they were not allowed to really see what was going on. I don't know if it was true or not, but I actually have very good reasons to believe that the operational plan of the Peace Springs operation was actually agreed upon between some Turks and Americans months ahead of all of these developments. So I don't know what went on in Washington, but something also went on in Washington, and there was a green light that Erdogan got. Whether he got it from President Trump or someone else, I don't know. Shaban, the $1,000,000 question, what would happen in Italy?
Well, I mean, it depends on whether short run, middle run, or long run. In the long run, we will all be dead.
So let's focus on the medium.
No, short run first. I think in Egypt, we have seen one of the greatest coordinations between Turkey and Russia in the Syrian theater so far. As you would recall, an imminent regime operation to take over Idlib has been discussed since 2016 or 2017. So far what kept the existing status quo there has been that special relationship Turkey fostered with Russia. So the bigger deal and understanding with Russia has helped Turkey to handle the Idlib challenge. So Turkey's main concern is to maintain the status quo as much as possible, meaning the political opposition, which is there, should maintain this position. In the meantime, of course, the challenge for Turkey was to address the presence of the unwanted elements there, Nusra and affiliated groups. For that, not only with the United States, but also with Russia, Turkey has been on the same page. But the disagreement Turkey had with others was how to deal with it. So the Russian way, meaning the Grozny style of dealing with this challenge, as we also seen in other theaters in Syria, or more gradual manner, meaning leave time space so that you can either transform those groups, convince them to join more moderate elements, or push them, force them to disband over the course of this policy. But so far as we have seen, on the big picture, Turkey hasn't been able to transform the unwanted Nusra-related elements. So they remain there as a potential source of threat, which is also acknowledged by Turkey, the West, and Russia, of course, and the Syrian regime. So the Syrian regime has been quite keen on getting there, and as you may have followed the Assad interview last week, he again repeated his determination to reunify Syria based on the existing borders, including not only Idlib but also all the way to the Iraqi border, meaning the American zone, the Turkish zone. These are all on his target list. The question is, at this stage, I think the actual ability and capabilities of the Assad regime to go and reconquer territory in Idlib, also further east. So in Idlib, the way I see it, Assad is not in a military position to impose what it wants in the short term, but in the medium term, I think the time is on his side. He can regain his power to concentrate his forces further on Idlib. So in that respect, what will keep an imminent military operation is still the political understanding between Turkey and Russia. And I have been making this bet since 2017. I never lost. So when there were similar questions about whether a regime military offensive, all-out offensive was imminent, I said no, because the Turkish-Russian understanding still holds. I think I am still there in the short run. I don't expect any major military action to change the existing status quo in Idlib. But I think the regime will continue its policy of bite by bite, slice by slice, moving into the province from the southern belt of the province. But no major battle in the short term.
So, Shaban, a $2 million follow-up question. Baghdadi was in Idlib, 5 kilometers away from the Turkish border and possibly even closer to one of the Turkish observation posts when he was killed. What does this mean? Why would Baghdadi prefer to hide in Idlib?
Because he was desperate. That's quite obvious. I think, given that in other areas he was not able to hide, so all the way to Idlib, since it is one of the areas which hosts people from all parts of Syria, as you would recall, as part of Astana process, we had 4 deconflicting zones. All of them after being taken over by the regime, people from the area, they all were dumped into Idlib. So this is the last resort for the lost causes on the Syrian battlefield. I think, again, by using all sorts of smuggling networks, including the PYD's Kurds' own smuggling network, he ended up there as a last resort. And I think beyond that, I don't put any meaning on this fact that he was captured there.
And probably the last thing he expected to see in Idlib was American Marines. And
I'm not sure, because also, I mean, here we should look at the motivation for the other remaining, the so-called jihadist groups. I think they all realize that this is their final battle. Beyond Idlib, there is no future for many of those groups and fighters. So they are there to wait for their final battle. And perhaps actually this was the reason why, despite having ideological differences with ISIS, they may have decided to host Baghdadi at the end of the day. So because they are all in the same ship waiting for their final battle on the military side in Syria.
Jonathan, back to you.
Great. We have another question. Yeah, we do.
Thank you. Just to go to Jerry Hyman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. Going back to Jonathan's very first point, and that is that it seems that the U.S.-Turkish relationship, as is the case for the U.S. relationship with other countries as well, has become a thick relationship between the leaders more than it has been as in times in the past. A look at where the interests of each state is long term. In the case of President Trump, it's difficult for U.S. citizens to understand exactly what the next U.S. position will be on any given situation. So it's hardly unreasonable to think that the Turks would have an even more difficult time, as indicated by the call to President Erdogan and the call to President Zelensky and the impeachment process and so on. You see that. So I guess the basic question is how to rescue the relationship and the thinking about the relationship from such a transactional and personalistic context. One phone call or one conversation or one individual actor, either President Trump or President Erdogan, to a more stable, long-term kind of relationship based on interests. In particular, so that's the basic question. The second, in specifically with respect to Syria and the Middle East, it seems to me that, I guess the question is whether President Erdogan, I won't say Turkey, but whether President Erdogan will be satisfied with the 30-kilometer zone or whether he has aspirations in Turkey beyond that. We began in a joint venture being opposed to the Assad regime and President Assad in particular, and that seems to have fallen by the wayside as we've gone along. Is President Erdogan, can we expect that there will be a conflict, a tension between Turkey and Syria so long as the Assad regime, not just President Assad, but the Assad regime remains there? Is Turkey going to be satisfied with the security of the border zone of 30 kilometers so that its own immediate security with respect to the YPG is satisfied? Where do you see Turkey going in the future with respect to Syria? And secondly, what about the Middle East more broadly?
So why don't we do this too? And I want to just add, thank you for that question. So there's the Syria equation, because absolutely there's been some shifts. I start to think here in the US, what shift has really taken place in terms of US policymakers as well, and sort of the implications of that. But also I just had two other questions, and I want to make sure we just had enough time. These are coming in from some different people that have asked some very specific questions who are watching sort of online. One of them, Ozgur, maybe, I don't know who wants to handle this one, but it's really about the motivations, the domestic motivations behind this operation, the political calculus about what's taken place. I mean, it's hard to fully know when you get into a conflict like this, what the ramifications will be, because things happen and conflict, and there's great instability. So there's a question about the political domestic calculation. And also, one of the arguments made by President Erdogan is the desire to create some sort of a safe zone for Syrian refugees to go back into Syria, creating a safe zone for them to return. And obviously people see the polling numbers in Turkey about how Turkish population feels about Syrian refugees. Turkey has taken in, the numbers are, some say about 3.7 million, but there's been upwards of over 4 million at one point or another in Turkey. Obviously a huge challenge, burden on Turkey. But those people who fled are clearly not people who feel very comfortable with the Assad regime. And lest we forget that there's millions more who have also fled as well, out of concern for their own domestic security and for retribution as well. So maybe you could just, I'll add that to the Syria question. whether or not you're starting to see some actual plan on the refugees, if that's really possible, and then also just some of the domestic political implications for what's taking place. So I think those will be the last three questions that we take, and then I'll ask you to wrap it up after that.
Thank you for those very good questions, but I know how it ends. It will start a debate between the three of us. I will enter a bet with Shaban and then end up buying him lunch. So, thank you for that, because, that's a recurring theme. But I will take part of the questions. The questions are actually all great. I wish we could talk for hours. The first one on what happens in US-Turkey relations next, or what could we hope to do. I think we should all have strategic patience. For anyone who still values the relationship, I certainly do. I'm sure people on the other sides of the computers also do. That's why we are talking now together. I think we all need to have strategic patience because I think that, and this is my personal view, not that of GMF, but before there is political change in Turkey, I don't think that Turkey's approach will change. And before there is political change in the United States, it will remain to be what it is. But if that political change is beyond our reach, and it certainly is, as think tankers, then we need to have strategic patience and avoid, at least, what we can avoid or what we can help avoid is permanent rupture. So the relationship will probably remain in coma for quite a few years at least. But what we should make sure is that there is no permanent rupture. And this brings me to the reaction of the US Congress. Look, let's take the case of, let's say, recognition of the Armenian genocide. This is a short-sighted weaponization of legislation of history. Now, what do I mean here? A parliament deciding that a certain incident happened in history is legislation of history. For some people, it's acceptable. For others, it is not. But this goes beyond it, actually. This is legislation of history, not for the sake of reality, but for the sake of punishing a country for an unrelated policy area. Now, this is an example which could actually create permanent rupture. It's also wrong. It's not my place to say, but if I were part of the Armenian constituency in the United States, I would feel that my cause, which I have been investing in for decades, is now being used for an unrelated cause. So these are actually examples of non-smart sanctions which could cause permanent ruptures. But other than that, we should first have strategic patience, but second, actually, and this is exactly what GMF and these colleagues will be trying to do in the upcoming period, is to come up with the elements, the building blocks of the next strategic framework of US-Turkey cooperation, which would address the mutual suspicions that the two countries have and would be more relevant in the 21st century, as opposed to being relevant only during the Cold War. So let me also take the question on how would Turkey, Syria fare in the future, and then leave it to Shaban and Haldun. I believe that although, of course, there is now bad blood between Presidents Erdogan and Assad, between Turkey and Syria, I do believe that we will be able to reach some sort of a modus vivendi because we don't have an alternative. Turkey does not have an alternative, and Assad regime does not have an alternative, and the two leaders have actually given indications. Erdogan, at some point when asked how he feels about the Syrian regime forces entering Manbij, he said it's Syria's own territory. Why should I be concerned about this? And more recently, President Assad has said, we have had some very bad experiences with Turkey, but I don't want to create a permanent enemy out of a neighbor. So these are gestures to each other that a modus vivendi could be possible. And as a citizen of Turkey, it bleeds my heart to see my country reaching a modus vivendi with a monster like Assad, but I don't have we have an option.
Let me try to answer 4 different questions. So as for the first question, what's the next for US-Turkey relations? as Ozgur very well described, relations 2.0. First of all, we need to damage control and then move forward. But a colleague of mine for a decade ago wrote a paper, an op-ed for 360-degree diplomacy of AKP governments. The paper was based on Armenia-Turkey relations. Actually, there are loops with the bilateral relations of Turkey under AKP governments with different countries. I mean, there are lots of examples: Turkey-Netherlands relations, Turkey-German relations, Turkey-Greece relations, Turkey-Armenia relations, and even for Assad, Turkey-Syria relations. And none of these bilateral relations stood steadily. And it's same for Turkey-Russia, and that's what I expect. And the Turkey-United States relations, there will be a loop and 360-degree coming back to the first point, This is my understanding. This is my take from the AKP governance for the foreign policy for the last 2 decades. As for the political domestic institutions and motivations for the Operation Peacekeeping, actually it is highly related to domestic politics and necessity of support. Even it is connected to the municipality elections and the re-election in Istanbul municipality, losing the support from Turkish society. And it is not hidden that for the last 2 years, AKP losing the support and polls have been decreasing. Thanks to the Operation Peacekeeping, it has increased, as you mentioned, alluded, Jonathan. So I think the main political domestic motivation is about President's political future. Some colleagues would say survival of his survival. It is highly connected. Will Erdogan be satisfied for the 30 kilometers for the safe zone? I mean, frankly speaking, Turkish military is under transformation from conscription to professional army. There are lots of human resources problems, and there are also some transformation of the troops. I wouldn't assume that Turkish military's capacity would make Turkey move beyond 30 kilometers, and they are exhausted because for the last 1 year, from November 2018 until 8th of October 2019, Turkish military was ready to launch a military operation against northern Syria. It was exhaustive, as you can imagine, from the human resources perspective. So I wouldn't assume, but if it is going to be necessary, I do believe Erdogan has a courage to take this decision. But it is not, let's say, a rational choice, but he would definitely take this decision. This is another issue. As for the Turkey and Assad regime issue, I think 30 kilometers of safe zone Operation Peacekeeping, they are all also related to the refugees, as you mentioned, and the reflection in Turkish society against refugees, 4 million refugees, and the economic cost of them. Definitely Erdogan, and sincerely Erdogan, wants him then go back to their country because he needs to increase his support from Turkish society, and it is also a tricky issue, refugee problem. It is not probable to let the Syrian refugees to go back, but it is possible. If something is possible, Erdogan would definitely take the risk, I think, from my point of view. That's all from my side.
Before turning to Shaman, one thing I forgot. I think President Trump made President Erdogan a very big disservice by withdrawing the American troops immediately, because I believe that President Erdogan was expecting a protracted conflict, like a protracted military operations for several months, probably longer than a year. Military pictures would be covering the news stories. Nobody would be talking about the situation of the economy and other issues. But with the US policy, the conflict was very short. And now we are back to the real agenda in Turkey, and voters are actually have very short memories. We had it actually. After the Operation Afrin, there was again a rally around the flag moment in Turkey, and this secured President Erdogan, the presidential election. But just a few months passed, nobody even remembers what Afrin was, and he lost the local elections. So I believe that the impact of this in the upcoming presidential election will be close to zero. If there are no early elections, which is a big question.
Yeah, regarding the current zone of control, I think going beyond the 30 kilometer, I don't think it is in the planning, but before that, so the 30 kilometer continuous zone is not a reality either. So there are different arrangements with Russia, with the United States presence. And recently we are also seeing reports that in certain areas, American military personnel are coming back. So along the border, what we will see different fragmented realities. So there is not one single zone with the same modus of operandi, different arrangements, different deals. And this is exactly what I said at the very beginning of the program. And I said the potential for going back to conflict option is not out of question. This is exactly what I meant. So we don't know what may happen. So there's always a risk of flashpoints drawing Turkey further in. But same for that, so the current policy is based on undoing the PYD, YPG political military control along the border. This is the first priority. Second is the refugee element. So the refugee element is not just about the domestic pressures. This is important, I also agree. But this is also about the way Ankara reads the Syrian strategic theater. So the thinking here is that there has been a sort of demographic engineering by the Assad regime plus the PYD. So in a sense, the current policy is meant to undo and, if possible, reverse the demographic engineering. So what we will see in the days ahead in the Turkish controlled areas. So in the current zone of Turkish control, probably this is what will happen. We will try to replicate the model which has been put into place since 2016, meaning we will try to create civilian governance structures. We will try to bolster the basic infrastructure, schools, hospitals, so on and so forth, so that the governance in the areas on the border will be more friendly to Turkey. Coming to the question about talking to Assad, this is also a big part of the Turkish discussions. So there is a growing narrative here in Ankara, especially from the opposition, and even from the pro-government circles, that for a durable solution to the Syrian crisis, Turkey should seriously consider talking to the Assad regime. So here I disagree with Ozgur. Probably this means another lunch on Ozgur.
Because I am his chair, I am his departmental chair, so he always agrees with me.
No, it doesn't mean I don't agree. No, I mean, so with Assad, Ozgur referred to recent statements from both sides, but for Turkey, I guess the key point here is how Assad behaves. So this is where the reference to the so-called Adana protocols is important. The interpretation of the Adana protocols is really important here. So from the Turkish point of view, I think Assad come back to the PYD controlled areas, to the border, is acceptable, but then how it behaves, whether it will try to use the PYD as a proxy to further destabilize Turkey, whether the Assad presence in the border areas will mean further security risks to Turkey. These are all open questions. So we don't know yet. So in that respect, I don't expect a kind of, in the short term, swift normalization between Ankara and Damascus at the political level, as was mentioned, as was acknowledged by both parties. security institutions have been talking. This will probably continue, but on the political level, open dialogue is not on the horizon in the short term. Okay.
Back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you for that. And I sort of share the same sentiments as Ozgur on this, that I get a sense too that others are going to be working out a deal with Assad, but what's taking place in Syria, war crimes that have taken place, is something that I hope that Ankara and the US don't overlook. But, and I'm obviously concerned that that type of history will be whitewashed in this process to go to the next. And I see those steps coming. And this includes actions taken by Russia, directly by Russian military in Syria that history will not look kindly on. And I hope that Turkey remembers this as well. But I'll end with this point, Ozgur, just on sort of the U.S.-Turkey strategic relationship. Yes, and new strategic framework is needed to address these mutual suspicions. And I like the idea, that we do have to think about strategic patience in this process, both Washington and Ankara, and no permanent rupture. I think it can be very difficult to do. Maybe what would just be sort of trying to maintain the status quo in the immediate term. But it's really important to keep that in mind. Saban, Haldun, I just want to thank you both for bringing in your expertise into a very complicated, challenging issue where people have various levels of understanding of what's taking place on the ground. And I do think that on these issues of the unknown of what will take place over the future, I think it's interesting to hear. I think one of you said in some respects it looks like President Trump may be responsible for Turkey's democratic reemergence on the ground. That's a first that you didn't quite say that, but it's quite, sometimes even Trump doesn't realize the unintended consequences of his own actions, both domestically here in the United States and then abroad. But I wanted to say thank you again for joining us. The On Turkey series that you have, I would really urge those who are sort of listening in and those that are here to go check out sort of the latest that you've been writing and other partners have been writing. And I think it's helpful to inform these conversations. We'll be having more of these, what we call pop-up webinars to give people an opportunity to ask questions. And I want to thank everybody who's joined from both in Europe and the United States and elsewhere for your questions as well. They were really helpful. And again, thank you to our speakers for joining us and those that are here in Washington on a Monday morning and your Monday evening in Europe. Thank you so much. Ozgur, anything that you want to add?
Jonathan, just thank you and your team for making this happen, and thanks to everyone for being with us.
Thank you.